Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Tonight's story begins in a quiet corner of history, where the world is not loud, or bright, or hurried. It opens in a place where the ground itself holds secrets, and where the soft weight of soil and silt has been quietly shaping human memory for thousands of years. If you listen closely, you might notice how the past seems to settle around us like dust drifting down in a still room. Nothing sudden, nothing dramatic, just a slow, steady fall of time, layering itself over what once existed. And so, as we begin this long walk through forgotten ages, you're invited to sit back, breathe a little slower, and let the story come toward you at its own gentle pace. This is the tale of the mud that buried civilizations. The mud that ancient people believed had swallowed entire worlds before their own. Mud that became myth. Mud that became explanation. Mud that became the quiet foundation of what many cultures described as a reset of mankind. The idea that the world has been washed clean before, and may be washed clean again, appears across continents. And while modern geology has its own thoughts on that subject, ancient people had a way of describing these events with a kind of sleepy certainty. To them, history was not a straight line. It sagged, it folded, it restarted, often with water, often with mud, and usually with a rather unimpressed tone, as if the universe simply got tired of whatever humans were doing and pressed a damp reset button. But before we drift too far ahead, let's settle into the landscapes that shaped these beliefs. If you picture the ancient world, you might imagine deserts, or shining capitals, or long-forgotten queens wearing improbable crowns. But many civilizations lived in places where the ground was not firm at all. River valleys flooded more often than their inhabitants would have preferred. Rain came in years-long tantrums. Coastal plains sank without apology. Human beings, being annoyingly persistent, built their homes, farms, and temples right next to the very forces that could erase them in a single season. Take the great river civilizations, for example, the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Indus. These rivers brought life, food, trade, and all the good things you would want if you were trying to not starve. But they also brought silty floods, thick layers of wet earth that crept into houses and buried entire streets. It wasn't the dramatic kind of destruction that storytellers like to include in movies. It was slow, creeping, and somehow even more unsettling. You would go to sleep with your storage jars safely stacked along the wall, and a few days later you would be digging them out of the ground, wondering if you should have placed them somewhere slightly less convenient for the river to reclaim. These quiet disasters shaped the way ancient people saw the world. When you live in a place where mud can swallow your work, your fields, and sometimes your entire settlement, you eventually begin to imagine that maybe it happened before. Maybe it happened in ways you never saw. Maybe the world has been wiped and rewritten so many times that your own life is just another thin line on a very thick tablet that the universe keeps erasing. One of the earliest written examples of this idea comes from Mesopotamia, where scribes loved two things: carving long stories into clay and complaining about floods. In their myths, they spoke of a time when the gods simply decided to remove humanity by water because humans were too noisy. There's something uniquely relatable about this divine reasoning. especially if you've ever lived near a busy neighborhood or tried to sleep while your neighbors enthusiastically tested the limits of their sound system at midnight. In the Mesopotamian flood story, the waters rose, the winds howled, and the entire world was reduced to wet silence. And when the waters retreated, what remained was not a dramatic, fiery wasteland. It was mud, thick, heavy mud stretching across the land. When the lone survivor stepped out of his boat, his feet sank into it. Civilization would have to start again from that quiet, sticky beginning. The idea of a muddy reset wasn't limited to Mesopotamia. Across the Mediterranean, Egyptian priests told of earlier ages when the Nile itself had swallowed kingdoms before the ones they knew. They were surprisingly calm about it. If an entire settlement disappeared under silt, it was simply the river reminding people who was in charge. The Egyptians had a complex relationship with their river. They depended on it for survival, admired it as a divine being, and occasionally seemed mildly irritated at it for destroying things they had just finished building. Archaeology has confirmed that parts of Egypt truly did vanish under layers of mud left by historic floods. Whole towns, sometimes entire temple complexes, disappeared so neatly that later generations built new ones on top, unaware of the older world resting beneath. There was no dramatic final day for these settlements, just years of rising water, rising mud, rising silence, and then farther east. The Indus Valley provides another soft-spoken reminder. This civilization was known for its tidy urban planning and very orderly public baths. They were the kind of people who would probably alphabetize their grain storage if given enough time. Yet even they could not fully control the rivers that watered their lives. Over time, shifting river courses and layers of sediment crept into their cities, making them uninhabitable. Bit by bit, the civilization thinned out. No big war, no sweeping conquest, just water, mud, and the quiet retreat of human life. It was the kind of ending that historians call gradual decline because calling it death by mud seems a bit impolite. As we move gently through these examples, you might notice a pattern. Mud is not the most exciting destroyer of worlds. It isn't fiery or loud. It doesn't roar like mythic serpents or crumble mountains with dramatic flair. It is slow, it is patient, and that patience shaped the way ancient thinkers imagined the past. Reset myths were often watery, muddy, and strangely peaceful. In some cultures, these myths became part of their identity. In ancient China, early legends spoke of floods so vast that the world seemed to have no dry land left at all. Heroes worked tirelessly to tame the waters, not by fighting them, but by guiding them. The landscape was shaped as much by silt as by divine intervention. And again, in many of these stories, the world after the flood was soft and muddy, a place where civilization had to step carefully and start over, even in regions where mud was less common. The idea of a muddy reset still appeared. In the Andes, people told stories about earlier ages destroyed by floods, with survivors climbing to mountaintops. Later, they found layers of lake sediment far above their villages and took these as physical reminders of the world's earlier undoings. In some traditions, the mud left behind after these ancient floods was thought to have shaped new humans quite literally. People formed from clay, shaped by the earth, given life again after the previous world had been washed away. As centuries passed, these stories layered themselves into cultural memory. Each generation inherited a version of the idea that the world had once been covered, buried, or reset. And each version added a little more detail, a little more symbolism, and occasionally a little more sarcasm about the behavior of humans before the reset. Many myths suggested that the earlier world failed because people were too loud, too proud, too careless, or sometimes just too plentiful. Apparently, the ancient gods were very picky landlords with a strict noise policy, but underneath the poetic exaggerations, something real lingered. Floods did bury civilizations. Mud did erase towns. And the memory of these events settled into stories that tried to make sense of them. When an older settlement was found beneath a newer one, ancient peoples saw it as proof of a world that had ended before theirs. And when we think about it gently, slowly, without rushing, we can see how this worldview brought a strange comfort. The idea that the world resets from time to time suggests that nothing is ever truly final. Even destruction is just a soft beginning in disguise. To understand why this idea of muddy resets became so widespread, we can drift into another quiet detail: ancient soil itself. When archaeologists dig through layers of earth, they find line stripes of color, texture, and material. Some layers are filled with pottery shards or ash. Others are simply smooth, thick bands of silt left by floods that came and went without much eventfulness. For ancient people who did their own digging, planting fields, building foundations, burying the occasional relative, it must have been quite striking to notice these layers. They were reminders that something big had happened long before they arrived. Maybe something world-ending. Maybe something worth telling around the hearth at night with a tone that said, well, if it happened once, it might happen again. So don't get too comfortable. And yet, these stories didn't frighten people. They soothed them. They explained things. They gave shape to the unknown past and the uncertain future. The mud that buried civilizations was not just a natural force. It was a storyteller. A quiet one, admittedly, but persistent. And every culture listened in its own way. If we sit with this idea for a moment, the ancient world becomes much easier to imagine. The air warm, the riverbanks soft underfoot, people moving slowly through their days, aware that the earth could rise around them at any time, not with anger, but simply with the calm inevitability of nature. As we settle deeper into this exploration, we begin to see how these muddy resets weren't just background events. They shaped entire belief systems. They shaped architecture, prompting people to build on higher ground or even on artificial mound platforms. They shaped rituals, with offerings made to river deities who were both generous and mildly inconvenient. They shaped calendars, with festivals marking the receding of floods. And they shaped identity, giving people stories about survival, renewal, and quiet beginnings. Even today, when we walk through archaeological sites where ancient floors lie beneath many layers of earth, the story of these resets becomes oddly calming. It reminds us that life continues even after slow, muddy disruptions. What was buried becomes memory. What was lost becomes inspiration. What was reset becomes a new version of the world. And now that we have eased ourselves into this first part of the journey, we can gently prepare to move farther. There are more myths to explore, more buried landscapes to uncover, and more quiet moments in history where the world simply started over without much fuss. Now that we've eased ourselves through the first layer of this long story, we can drift a little deeper into the soft ground beneath ancient memory. There's no need to hurry. History rarely rewards speed, especially the quiet kind we are exploring tonight. Instead, we will let the details rise gently, like the slow swelling of a river after distant rain in the previous part. We looked at how mud shaped the earliest ideas of a world wiped clean. Now we move into the older, deeper stories that civilizations use to explain not just floods, but the peculiar feeling that the world had lived many lives before their own. If you imagine ancient people sitting under low firelight, telling stories to the steady hum of night insects, you get a small sense of how these ideas passed from generation to generation. They weren't always told to terrify or astonish. Often they were told the way someone explains a stubborn household problem. Ah yes, the land swallowed our neighbors again. It tends to do that. Let's begin this part by settling into the landscapes where these myths matured. It helps to picture them clearly, because environment shapes belief more than anything else. When you live in a place where the earth likes to rearrange itself at surprising hours, you tend to develop certain philosophies. They may not be the most cheerful philosophies, but they do come with a strong sense of humility and a mild suspicion that nature is playing an ongoing joke. One such place was the broad floodplain of Mesopotamia. Its soil was so soft and pliable that a child could dig their hand into it with ease. Entire cities sat on what you might call a geological cushion, one that changed shape with the seasons. When storms rolled in from the Persian Gulf or snow melted in distant Anatolian mountains, the rivers would rise and spread across the land with the sort of quiet determination that made people nervous. The water brought life, yes, but it also brought the kind of mud that didn't politely leave. It stayed, it thickened, it settled into corners. People dug it out, piled it up, shaped it into bricks, and prayed that the next flood wouldn't be too offended by their efforts. In places like this, myths about resets made perfect emotional sense. The ground beneath one's feet was a reminder that the past wasn't gone. It was right below you, waiting to be rediscovered the next time someone built a foundation trench for a house. People found older walls buried under newer ones, pottery scattered between layers of brown silt. It didn't take much imagination to suppose that a whole world had disappeared there once. Its inhabitants, swept aside by water and smothered by mud. When archivists and storytellers, often the same people in those days, began recording these memories on clay tablets, they turned environment into mythology. They described the world not as something permanent, but as something that restarted whenever it became too crowded, too noisy, too disorganized, or too inconvenient for the gods. The gods of Mesopotamia were known for many things, but patience was not one of their most celebrated qualities. So when humans annoyed them, the solution was straightforward: send water, erase everything, and begin again. A tidy cosmic reset. Yet even within this framework, there was a sense of calm. These stories didn't describe panic. They described inevitability. The world ended the way a riverbank erodes slowly, steadily, without drama, and afterward came the same familiar work of clearing mud, shaping bricks, rebuilding walls, replanting fields, and teaching children not to wander too close to the water during flood season. As we drift slowly eastward from Mesopotamia, we arrive at the Indus Valley once more, but with a slightly different lens. The people there built cities with such neat precision that modern archaeologists still find the layout soothing. Their drainage systems were remarkably organized, far more than some modern cities, though we probably shouldn't tell anyone that. Yet despite their best efforts, the rivers around them shifted with the casual attitude of a creature rolling over in its sleep. When the rivers changed course, the land changed with them. Soil accumulated where it wasn't wanted. Whole parts of the civilization were gradually left without the water they depended on. It was slow, and it was muddy, and it was irreversible in such conditions. The idea of a world that resets itself doesn't sound like superstition. It feels like a practical observation dressed in mythological clothing. If your city can vanish beneath layers of silt in a generation, it isn't hard to imagine that older worlds vanished the same way. Perhaps the ancestors told stories not to explain nature, but to remind people that survival required paying attention to it. When the ground begins to rise around your doorstep, it may not be a metaphor. It may be the universe's gentle hint that it's time to move. As we keep drifting, we find ourselves in Egypt again, but this time we listen more closely to their priests and scholars. To the Egyptians, the world did not begin in chaos and violence. It emerged gently from the waters of Nun, the dark primordial flood. Life rose out of mud, shaped by divine hands, warmed by the sun god, and placed carefully onto the solid mound that became the first land. This image of creation as a slow emergence from water and earth was so central to Egyptian belief that many of their temples were designed to mimic the moment of creation. The floors rose gradually from low to high, like a symbolic mound rising from the flood. It was a peaceful view of cosmic resets. In Egyptian time cycles, the world had ended and begun multiple times, not with explosions or divine tantrums, but with the slow rhythm of inundation and retreat. The Nile taught them that destruction and renewal were two sides of the same gentle process. A bad flood could bury homes, but a good one could ensure a year of abundance. This dual nature shaped their myths. Eras ended not with noise, but with water quietly covering the land, until a new age emerged from the Silt dot, moving across the Mediterranean toward ancient Greece. We encounter versions of the same idea, although the Greeks added a bit more personality to the story. They described cycles of humanity: Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, Heroic Age, and Iron Age. Each cycle ended differently, but many involved water or mud swallowing earlier worlds. The story of Deucalion and Pyrrha is essentially a Greek retelling of an older Near Eastern flood myth, though with more philosophical reflection and slightly more concern about repopulation logistics. But underneath the storytelling, the Greek view was consistent with what we've seen before. Worlds end quietly and begin again, usually with mud involved. As we drift farther west or south, we find that reset myths are everywhere. In some traditions, the previous world sank beneath the earth. In others, it dissolved. In many, it flooded. Nearly all describe an earlier age that became uninhabitable, leaving behind traces that the current generation occasionally uncovered. People found bones, foundations, tools, and sometimes entire buried buildings. They assumed they belonged to earlier humans or earlier versions of humanity. They weren't wrong. Archaeology today finds similar things. It's just that our explanations involve more diagrams and fewer sea gods. But the idea of mud burying a civilization wasn't only about literal soil. It also became a metaphor for forgetting. When a society collapsed or faded, its memory softened. Its stories became distorted. Its monuments eroded until they resembled natural features. And eventually the world forgot its details. In that sense, mud was both physical and symbolic. It covered not only ruins, but history itself. One of the most interesting examples comes from Anatolia, where cities like Catalyok were built layer upon layer, generation after generation, each time clearing older structures and building new ones on top. By the time later inhabitants reached a certain depth, they found themselves in chambers belonging to people whose lives were no longer remembered. It must have felt like excavating a different age of the world entirely. No wonder myths spoke of earlier creations destroyed and rebuilt. When your city literally sits atop older cities, it's easy to believe that civilization resets itself over time. It's worth pausing for a moment to consider how ancient people understood time differently from us. They did not see it as a straight, rigid timeline. They saw it as loops, spirals, cycles. Their years turned with the seasons. Their calendars repeated. Their rituals reenacted creation and renewal. If nature behaved cyclically, the world itself probably did too. And if floods and mud erased parts of the old world, then each cycle began in the same soft, damp way. This conception of time made reset myths even more comforting. If everything repeats, then nothing is truly lost. It simply waits beneath the surface, like a seed in the soil. Deep down, quite literally, human memory was stored in mud. When archaeologists dig today, they find not only objects, but layers of time. The ancient world must have understood this instinctively. Their myths turned these layers into stories. Let's drift now into a gentler, more contemplative corner of this topic, the experience of excavating buried cities. For ancient people, digging wasn't a scientific activity. It was practical. You dug to build a house, or to create a storage pit, or to plant grain. And sometimes you found unexpected things. Bones larger than any animal you knew. Pottery styles unlike your own. Stone foundations so old they crumbled at a touch. These discoveries encouraged the belief that earlier worlds existed. They were the fossils of mythology, fragments of forgotten eras. Even today, when we uncover ancient sites, the process feels dreamlike. You remove soil carefully, brushing away dust to reveal floors, hearths, and walls that haven't seen sunlight for thousands of years. The effect is strangely intimate. You touch the same surfaces that earlier humans touched, without ever knowing their names or stories. It gives a sense of how easy it is for a civilization to sink into the earth and be forgotten. It also explains why ancient people spoke of resets not with fear, but with acceptance. They saw the earth reclaim things. They knew that everything eventually settled back into the ground. This idea shaped their philosophies too. In many traditions, humans were believed to be made of clay or earth. When they died, they returned to it. The cycle mirrored the rise and fall of civilizations. Mud created, mud destroyed, mud preserved, mud forgot. And after some time, just enough to become a good story, mud revealed things again, letting new people wonder about the old ones. By this point, you may notice that our journey feels slow and soft. And that is exactly how these myths should be understood. They're not stories of catastrophe, at least not in the modern sense. They are stories of transition. They describe worlds that end the way a candle burns out, quietly, without fuss. And then from the remnants, a new flame is lit. As part 2 draws toward its close, we settle into a broader view. The mud that buried civilizations was more than sediment. It was a storyteller across continents. It taught people that nothing stays the same, that nature forgets and remembers in equal measure, and that every age of humanity lives on borrowed time, floating gently between cycles. Now that we've wandered through the physical landscapes that shaped reset myths, we can settle into an even quieter layer of this story. This part moves into the minds of the people who told these tales, repeated them, wrote them down, and carried them across regions. Not the farmers or builders this time, but the observers, the priests, the early historians, the wandering storytellers, and the people who made a profession out of remembering things long after others forgot. They tended to speak slowly, think carefully, and take notes in ways that suggested they weren't entirely confident future generations would appreciate their efforts. Still, they wrote, and what they wrote helps these flood and mud myths travel farther than the mud itself ever did. Let's begin with the ancient scribes of Mesopotamia, who deserve more appreciation than they usually receive. Their world was a calm, predictable rhythm of clay tablets, reed styluses, and the slow drying of texts under the sun. Each tablet was a small piece of permanence in a world where houses, temples, and crops could be covered by flood deposits within a single season. Writing was their way of resisting oblivion. The flood myths they recorded were not just warnings. They were observations disguised as cosmic narratives. When they wrote that earlier generations had been wiped clean by water, they were trying to make sense of ruins already buried in their own time. Scribes loved structure, and their myths reflect this. They describe cycles of kingship, with lists of rulers who reigned before and after resets. These lists were calm and matter-of-fact, even when the reigns lasted thousands of years. Whether those numbers were symbolic, exaggerated, or simply optimistic is up for debate. But what matters is the tone. The scribes presented resets as part of a natural order, as mundane as the rising of the river or the repair of a damaged wall. Floods came, floods went, civilizations rose, civilizations sank. Write it all down. Move on while Mesopotamian scribes were carving their thoughts into clay. Egyptian priests were writing on papyrus with a different sense of purpose. Their myths leaned toward cosmic continuity rather than abrupt endings. They saw creation as something that unfolded gently and repeatedly, a pattern rather than a singular event. According to their beliefs, the world emerged from the primeval waters more than once, and each new era resembled the last in quiet, recognizable ways. Mud was the medium of creation, a soft surface shaped by divine hands. Floods weren't a threat. They were a reminder of origins. Priests described resets with a kind of serene inevitability. They believed that the world, like the Nile, had a pulse. It flooded, receded, flooded again. This rhythm formed the backbone of Egyptian cosmology. When they spoke of ancient floods, they were not imagining disasters. They were imagining the repetition of something familiar. It's worth noting that Egyptian priests did not enjoy surprises. Their religious system valued predictability, cycles, and the comforting idea that everything important had already happened. Their flood myths reflect this mindset. The destruction of earlier worlds was not portrayed as chaos. It was portrayed as the necessary prelude to order. As we drift farther from the temple precincts of Egypt, we find ourselves with another class of observers, the early travelers. These were not tourists. Exactly. They were merchants, messengers, wandering artisans, or individuals who found themselves unable to stay put. When they crossed regions, they carried stories with them. Many of the earliest reset myths spread through trade routes, echoing across river valleys and deserts with the unhurried steadiness of a caravan. Imagine a traveler stopping in a market town after a long journey. He shares a story about a flood that buried an earlier kingdom in mud. Locals listen, nod politely, and perhaps share their own version. The traveler moves on. The story stays, grows, changes, and sinks into the soil of the new region. It was through these slow exchanges that flood myths took on shapes so similar that modern scholars often wonder whether they were shared originally or simply inspired by similar environments. It may be both. When many people live near rivers, they eventually tell similar stories about those rivers. One of the earliest known examples of long-distance story sharing comes from the people who lived along the eastern Mediterranean coast. These were sailors, merchants, and storytellers who spoke languages now long gone. Their knowledge of the sea and their occasional encounters with storms or rising waters gave them a sense that the world's boundaries were not fixed. When they heard tales of floods from Mesopotamian travelers, they absorbed them and retold them with their own details. Slowly, as they sailed from port to port, reset myths traveled as quietly and efficiently as jars of grain or bolts of cloth, while travelers passed stories horizontally across communities. Scholars and proto-historians passed them vertically across generations. These were the thinkers who tried to write histories of the world long before the concept of history existed in a modern sense. Their works were full of genealogies, lost ages, lists of kings, and occasional philosophical reflections that hinted at their mild distrust of human behavior. They loved the idea of earlier worlds that had ended due to moral decline. To them, history was a cycle of mistakes repeated with impressive dedication in ancient Greece. Early historians liked to blend myth with observation. They wrote about floods that destroyed earlier ages and commented on how the landscape itself seemed to confirm these stories. They found shells on mountaintops, fossil beds near riverbanks, and layers of sediment in valleys. Without modern geology, these discoveries fueled imaginative explanations. Flood myths weren't just stories, they seemed like historical facts that had been poetically framed. Some Greek thinkers believed that the world experienced periodic destructions by water and fire. Water ended one age, fire ended another. The process alternated in a cosmic rhythm. While we now know this isn't scientifically accurate, the idea carried profound symbolic meaning. And symbolically, mud was once again the sign of an age reset. As we move farther into Asia, we find historians in China who were equally interested in ancient resets. They wrote of the Great Flood, a legendary event that lasted generations. It wasn't a sudden catastrophe, but a long, slow disaster very appropriate for our theme. According to these accounts, waters covered the land for so long that people adapted to a new lifestyle, building homes on mountainsides or on stilts. When the flood finally receded, the mud left behind shaped the new world. The legend of the Great Yu, who tamed the waters, reflects not only engineering feats, but a worldview in which humans restore order after nature resets it. Chinese historians approach time with a cyclical philosophy too. Dynasties rose and fell in predictable patterns. Natural disasters were signs that one cycle had reached its end. Floods buried old capitals. Earthquakes rearranged landscapes. The world renewed itself like a field plowed for a new harvest. Mud was both destruction and foundation, a reminder of where the next era would be built. Now we can drift toward another group, the priests of Central and South America, who preserved myths of earlier worlds washed away by water. In some traditions, the gods destroyed failed versions of humanity not out of anger, but because the experiments simply didn't work very well. The earlier humans were made of different materials, mud, wood, or maize, depending on the culture. The mud people dissolved in rain, which must have been disappointing for everyone involved. The wood people lacked souls. The maize people, however, held together nicely. This sequence of creation and destruction, told in calm, ceremonial tones, mirrored the natural cycles of flood and drought familiar to the region. The mud that erased earlier people was also the mud from which later people were shaped. Reset and renewal flowed into each other seamlessly. Across these cultures, one thing becomes clear. Resets were never seen as total annihilation. They were transformations. The world didn't end in a dramatic explosion. It ended in familiar waves floods, mudslides, gradual collapses, and afterward came a new beginning. This continuity mattered deeply to the scholars and storytellers who preserved these myths. They were not documenting a single past. They were documenting the rhythm of existence. We should pause here and imagine the environment these early historians lived in. Much of the land they studied was layered with evidence of older civilizations buried beneath them. The ruins didn't shout. They rested quietly under the soil, waiting for a foundation dig or a riverbank collapse to reveal them. The historian who discovered an old wall beneath his feet didn't think of archaeology. He thought of earlier worlds. He thought of resets. And he wrote those thoughts into his scrolls or inscribed them into stone. This calm sense of continuity influenced early architecture as well. Many ancient structures were built on artificial mounds or raised platforms. These weren't only for protection from floods. They were symbolic gestures acknowledging that the world beneath was layered with past ages. Each new structure became a statement of its time, resting on the forgotten foundations of previous times. The mud that buried old buildings became part of new ones. Civilization was recycling itself long before recycling became fashionable. One might wonder whether ancient scholars ever doubted their reset myths. The answer seems to be no. They accepted them the way one accepts sunrise and sunset, not because they understood the mechanics, but because they observed the patterns. Floods came. Ruins were found deep underground. Fossils appeared in places where no living creature resembled them. The simplest explanation was that previous worlds existed and ended. These scholars didn't need geological charts or carbon dating. The land itself was their textbook. Another reason they accepted reset myths so easily was that they fit neatly into early moral philosophy. Many societies believed that worlds ended when people became corrupt or disorderly. It was a gentle warning, wrapped in myth and sediment. Behave, or the universe may decide to start over. Not in a fiery apocalypse, but in a slow, muddy way that ruins your sandals and undermines your grain storage. A fate worse than divine judgment, some might say. But even in these moral interpretations, there was little fear. The resets were portrayed as natural corrections rather than punishments. The world simply tidied itself when necessary. If anything, the myths provided comfort. They suggested that destruction was survivable, that life reappears even after everything seems lost. It gave people a reason to rebuild, to plant crops, to raise children, knowing that they were part of a cycle much larger than themselves. As we near the end of, we settle into a broad reflection. The priests, historians, and travelers who preserved these stories didn't do so to frighten anyone. They did it to make sense of the quiet patterns they saw around them. Their myths were shaped by soft riverside soil, by layered ruins, by drifting silt, by landscapes that changed slowly but relentlessly. They believed in resets because resets were visible in the ground. Let's drift now into the soil itself. Not the mythic soil we've wandered around in before, but the quiet, heavy, physical layers that archaeologists spend their careers brushing, sorting, and politely arguing about. This part of our long, sleepy journey settles into the ground where ancient worlds lie stacked like pages in an unfinished book. Each layer tells a story, though the stories don't speak loudly. They whisper. Some barely speak at all. Archaeologists must listen with tools, patience, and an impressive willingness to sit in dirt for long periods of time, to understand why ancient people believed in resets. We need to look at what remains beneath their feet and what didn't. Much of history isn't preserved in monuments or inscriptions. It's preserved in mud. Soil is an excellent archivist. It doesn't always label its files clearly, but it keeps everything: seeds, bones, pottery shards, fallen walls, sometimes entire rooms that look as if someone stepped out for a moment and forgot to return for 1,000 years. Imagine an ancient settlement built beside a river. People build their homes with mud brick, which seems like a reasonable material choice until the first flood season comes. The water rises, the banks soften, and by the time the river calms, it has kindly deposited several tons of wet earth where the settlement used to be. If the people rebuild sometimes in the same spot, because convenience is a powerful motivator, they create a new layer. And another, and another. Over centuries, cities become vertical sandwiches of human life, each layer marked by the quiet signature of mud. When modern archaeologists uncover these layers, they find evidence of resets that ancient people witnessed firsthand. A thick band of homogeneous fine silt might stretch across the site like a drawn-out sigh. That band means a flood strong enough to bury everything. Above it, a new floor, a new house, a new pot or hearth. Then another layer of silt, another interruption, another reset. Sometimes the layers alternate in almost rhythmic patterns. Mud, occupation. Mud so consistent that early excavators joked the ancient river had a very predictable sense of timing. These stratified records show us what ancient people saw with their own eyes. Worlds ending quietly and beginning again. Let's settle into one specific site to make this clearer. The ancient Mesopotamian city of Shuruppak is a good example. Archaeologists digging there found a thick flood layer dating to roughly the same era as the earliest written flood myths. The layer is unmistakable smooth, uniform, several feet thick, with no sign of human activity inside it. The people living there experienced a destructive flood, so significant that it sealed off an entire chapter of their city's life. When they rebuilt above it, their descendants eventually interpreted the buried world below as part of a grander, mythic reset. And who could blame them? Finding a whole civilization beneath yours would make anyone suspicious that the world had ended at least once. Now let's drift gently to another region, the Indus Valley. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa show a similar pattern. Archaeologists discovered layers of mud and silt interrupting the orderly architecture. Some of these layers indicate years of flooding that force people to abandon and later return. The resets here were calm and gradual, almost polite. No single catastrophic moment, just the steady accumulation of sediment, year by year, until homes became impractical to live in, for ancient people walking on uneven ground, feeling the soft give of accumulated silt beneath their feet. The idea of earlier worlds buried below was not a distant theory. It was a fact of daily life. If you dig a well and discover walls older than anyone remembers, you will conclude that earlier people lived there. If no one remembers those people, you will assume that a great event erased them. And if that great event involved water because everything, in your region involves water, you will conclude that the world once flooded enough to start over. Archaeological evidence mirrors these beliefs so neatly that one might say ancient storytellers were better observers than we often credit them for. They didn't need carbon dating. They had curiosity, shovels, and a willingness to draw cosmological conclusions from soil texture. As we continue, let's take a slow step toward Egypt again. But this time we'll examine the ground beneath their temples. Many sacred sites in Egypt sit atop older structures, which in turn lie above even older ones. Flood deposits from the Nile fill in the gaps, sometimes thin layers, sometimes thick. At the ancient city of Tanis, archaeologists found entire temple complexes buried under meters of Nile silt. These were not lost through dramatic catastrophe, but through centuries of repeated inundation. When later priests discovered hints of these buried temples, it reinforced their belief that earlier ages had vanished and been replaced by newer ones. Egyptian builders responded by raising temples on higher foundations, creating platforms that grew taller as centuries passed. These platforms symbolized the primordial mound rising from the floodwaters, but they also served a practical purpose, lifting sacred ground above the annual mud. This merging of symbolism and practicality is one of the most calming features of Egyptian architecture. Their myths weren't abstract. They were reflections of their environment. If we drift farther west into the Mediterranean, we encounter cities that vanished under mudslides and siltation rather than river floods. Ancient Troy, for instance, has multiple layers of occupation stacked vertically, each representing a different era of life. While not all of its destruction was caused by mud, some of it might have involved unhelpful neighbors with swords. The archaeological layers show periods when the city was abandoned and later rebuilt. These gaps in occupation became fertile ground for myths about earlier worlds and heroic resets. Farther inland, entire Bronze Age settlements in Central Europe lie buried under thick layers of mud deposited by river overflow or long-term sedimentation. Ancient people living generations after these events stumbled upon these buried sites and wove stories about lost towns swallowed by the earth. When they found old walls poking from the ground after heavy rains, it must have felt like discovering a ghostly fragment of a forgotten world. And now let's take a much gentler turn toward South and Central America, where entire cities were overtaken not by dramatic volcanic events, though that did happen too, but by slow environmental shifts. In parts of the Amazon, archaeologists have found vast networks of ancient earthworks hidden beneath soil and vegetation. These structures were not destroyed suddenly. They were gradually buried as rivers changed course and sediment accumulated. Indigenous myths from these regions describe earlier ages washed away by floods, with survivors rebuilding on higher ground. Their stories are not exaggerations. They are summaries of landscape behavior. At times, archaeological evidence can feel eerily close to mythic description. In Mexico's Valley of Mexico, ancient cities lie beneath layers of lake sediment. These lakes have expanded and contracted many times over thousands of years, swallowing settlements along their shores. People living there would occasionally unearth artifacts from earlier eras, leading them to conclude that the land had reset itself multiple times. One particularly calm example comes from the ancient Maya city of Palenque. While not buried in mud entirely, parts of the surrounding region experienced repeated flooding. Maya myths describe earlier creations washed away by water. They also mention humans made from mud in the earliest. attempts a metaphor that makes practical sense when you live in a region where mud preserves everything except your dignity when you slip in it. As we move through these examples, a quiet picture emerges. Civilizations didn't need dramatic collapses to imagine resets. They only needed time, water, and soil. Mud became both the eraser and the archive. It buried worlds and preserved them at the same time. The result was a landscape that whispered of earlier ages every time someone dug a trench, planted a crop, or built a home. Now let's drift into the archaeological process itself. Modern archaeology is often portrayed as glamorous, but much of it involves gently scraping dirt with tools small enough to make you question your life choices. Slow brushing, careful lifting, notebooks filled with sketches of soil layers that look almost identical to untrained eyes. Archaeologists interpret these layers the way historians interpret texts. A thin ash band might signal a fire. A thick mud band might signal a flood. A sudden absence of artifacts suggests abandonment. A dense accumulation suggests a thriving settlement. In this sense, archaeologists read mud the way scribes read clay tablets. Both are deciphering messages from the past. The difference is that clay tablets don't require you to sit under the sun for hours brushing dust out of your eyebrows. Soil, on the other hand, demands patience. It offers discoveries slowly. But when those discoveries appear, they provide context for ancient beliefs. For example, when archaeologists find human remains buried beneath flood layers, they know the flood was sudden enough to catch people by surprise. When they find entire houses preserved under silt, they know the inhabitants didn't return. These findings help explain why ancient people believed in resets. The evidence was literally beneath their hands. We should also consider how mud preserves objects. In dry conditions, organic materials crumble. But in wet, oxygen-poor mud, things last. Wooden tools, seeds, textiles, even footprints. Archaeologists have found ancient paths worn into wet clay, then sealed by flood silt, creating perfect impressions of daily life before the reset. These details give us an intimate view of ancient worlds vanishing quietly beneath rising earth. In some places, mud preserves even the moment of abandonment. At the Neolithic site of Catalyuk, earlier houses lie beneath layers of compacted earth. Each layer holds traces of the last meal cooked, the last pottery made, the last sweep of a broom. Nothing dramatic. Just ordinary life frozen in soil, for ancient people who later dug into these layers. It must have seemed like discovering the remains of a different age, one erased but intact. Now let's consider the psychological effect of finding buried worlds. Imagine being an ancient farmer digging a post hole for a house, only to hit a carved stone belonging to people no one remembers. Or imagine living near a river that exposes pottery fragments after each flood. These encounters with the past shaped belief systems. They taught people that the world had been inhabited before, and if earlier worlds ended, then the present one might too. But because the evidence was calm and undramatic, the resets felt natural rather than apocalyptic. One idea becomes clear. Ancient reset myths were not invented from imagination alone. They were grounded quite literally in earth. Mud recorded the rise and fall of civilizations with more accuracy than any ancient historian. And people paid attention. They read the land the same way we read books. They saw layers. They saw endings. They saw beginnings. And they turned these observations into stories that felt both true and comforting. Now we drift into the quieter, more philosophical side of this long story. Up to now, we've explored how mud literally buried ancient worlds. In this part, we slip into the symbolic meanings those layers came to hold. This is where ancient people stopped simply observing the landscape and started using it to think about themselves, their societies, and the strange, persistent patterns of human behavior. Even the calmest civilizations eventually asked the same question: why does the world begin again? And equally important, why does it begin the way it does, slowly, softly, with mud? To understand the symbolism, it helps to imagine the ancient world without our modern distractions. People had long nights, quiet fields, and plenty of time to think. When they looked at the land around them, they saw that creation and destruction followed the same gentle process. Mud wasn't a sign of chaos. It was a sign of transition, the end of something and the beginning of something else. A blank page provided by nature. Let's start with a simple truth that almost every ancient society recognized. Mud is both mess and material. It is the thing that destroys your house and the thing you rebuild your house with. It buries your fields, then becomes the soil that nourishes them. It covers a ruined city, then preserves it for future generations to uncover. This double nature made mud an obvious metaphor for life, death, time, and renewal. In Mesopotamia, people believed humans were made from clay mixed with divine breath. The symbolism is clear. Humans are fragile, shaped by the earth, dependent on water, and easily dissolved back into the soil. Their flood myths reinforced this view. When a great inundation covered the world, it wasn't punishment in a fiery or dramatic sense. It was the universe returning everything to its basic material, ready to be shaped again. Clay to clay, mud to mud. A calm cosmic reset. The Sumerians saw no contradiction between mud as a destructive force and mud as a creative force. To them, both came from the same divine source. If the gods wanted to wipe the slate clean, they didn't need lightning or earthquakes. They only needed water and time, which they already had in generous supply. This view fostered a kind of philosophical acceptance. If destruction is natural, then renewal is natural too. There's no point getting overly emotional about either process. Moving west toward Egypt, the symbolism becomes even deeper. Egyptians viewed the Nile's mud as sacred. When the waters receded after inundation, they left behind a dark, fertile layer called KMT, the Black Land, which gave Egypt its ancient name. This mud was the essence of life. Without it, nothing grew. With it, everything flourished. And so every flood, even the problematic ones, symbolized rebirth. This belief shaped their cosmology. According to Egyptian creation myths, the world first emerged from chaotic waters onto a mound of mud. This primeval mound represented potential, stability, and the first moment of order. Every temple raised above flood level symbolized that mound. Every festival marking the receding of the Nile reenacted creation. Mud was not just part of nature. It was the foundation of existence. Because of this, Egyptian reset myths felt gentle, almost reassuring. When they imagined earlier worlds that had ended, they didn't picture fiery cataclysms or divine wrath. They pictured waters rising, land disappearing, and a new mound emerging, a natural cycle, not a catastrophe. Their philosophy was simple. Creation rises softly from the flood, and when needed, it returns to it. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet turning of the cosmic calendar. Farther east, in India, the symbolism took a different but equally calm form. Hindu cosmology describes cycles of creation and destruction called kalpas and yugas. These cycles stretch over immense spans of time, so long that they make modern lifespans feel like small interruptions. Floods appear in these stories too, often as transitions between ages. The god Vishnu, in various forms, rescues the seeds of the next world during the flood. Then comes a new beginning. Indian philosophers never saw the universe as static. It was always dissolving and reforming, like clay kneaded by a potter. Mud and water symbolized impermanence, and impermanence symbolized truth. Reset myths weren't meant to alarm. They were lessons. Everything changes. Everything returns to its source. Everything emerges again. As we wander south into Southeast Asia, we find similar ideas. Flood myths, creation stories, and symbolic interpretations of mud show up in region after region. In many traditions, the earth itself is said to rest on water. When that water rises, earlier worlds are submerged. When it lowers, new land appears. This rhythmic breathing of the universe shaped their understanding of time and identity. The symbolic meaning becomes even more interesting when we drift toward Mesoamerica. There, the Maya and other cultures told of earlier creations made from mud or clay. These beings fell apart in the rain because they lacked strength or essence. Later, humans made from maize became more durable. This story, while playful, reflects a deeper symbolic truth. Mud represents potential without purpose. It is form without endurance. When the world resets, it returns to this formless state, waiting to be shaped into something meaningful. The Aztecs believed in 5 worlds, 4 of which had already been destroyed, 1 by water, 1 by wind, 1 by jaguars, and 1 by fiery rain. The water destruction, which covered the world in mud, was always spoken of in calm, matter-of-fact tones. It had happened. It would happen again, not out of cruelty, but because the universe followed cycles. Things ended, things began, and humans were simply participating in the latest version of the pattern. Now let's drift into how ancient philosophers used mud as a symbol for human memory. Many cultures believed that the past became muddy over time. This wasn't meant literally. It meant that memories softened, details blurred, stories mixed together like wet earth, and eventually new narratives grew from that mixture. Mud symbolized forgetting as much as it symbolized renewal. When a civilization collapsed, its memory dissolved into the symbolic mud of time. Later, societies found pieces of eaten object here. A wall that Rand reconstructed, a version of the lost world, shaped like clay in their own hands. This blending of truth and imagination is exactly how myths grow. They emerge from layers of memory the same way cities emerge from layers of soil. And just as mud preserves physical objects, it preserves cultural impressions enough to create stories, but not enough to answer every question. Symbolically, mud is the medium through which the past speaks softly rather than loudly. We should also consider how mud became a symbol of humility. Many ancient texts remind people that they are of the earth, meaning fragile, temporary, shaped by forces larger than themselves. Civilizations that experienced repeated floods embraced this symbolism without embarrassment. They understood the lesson. Humans build, nature resets. Humans rebuild. In the grand scheme, trying to outlast the mud is a losing game. But working with the mud, shaping it into bricks, pottery, foundations, that is the way to live. This philosophy produced a kind of peaceful resignation. Not the defeatist kind, but the wise, observational kind. If the world resets, then every generation begins with a fresh mixture of the old and the new. The past literally becomes part of the material for the future. Mud is continuity disguised as disruption. Interestingly, some cultures used mud symbolically in rituals. In parts of Mesopotamia and Egypt, clay figurines represented enemies or negative forces. During rituals, these figurines were dissolved in water or buried. The act symbolized the return of chaos to the primordial state. It was a miniature reset, a safe and controlled version of the universal cycle. The idea was simple. If you symbolically return your troubles to mud, the world around you remains balanced and calm. A reset in miniature prevents a reset on a larger scale. In some Pacific Island cultures, myths describe worlds disappearing under rising waters, with survivors climbing mountains or floating on trees. These myths were passed down through generations as symbolic reminders that life is change. Mud becomes the boundary between old and new worlds. The symbolism is gentle, no apocalyptic terror, just a reminder that the sea gives and takes, and that people must adapt. In many African traditions, the symbolism of mud connects to ancestry. Villages built near rivers often preserve old burial grounds beneath layers of silt. Ancestors are literally part of the soil. When people dig to create new homes or fields, they encounter pieces of the past. Mud becomes a symbol of memory, continuity, and lineage. It is not something to fear. It is something to respect. By now, we can see that ancient philosophies surrounding mud were incredibly nuanced. Mud symbolized the beginning and the end, forgetting and remembering, destruction and renewal, weakness and potential. It was one of the most flexible metaphors available to early thinkers. And because it was everywhere beneath their feet, on their walls, in their rivers, it became a quiet, universal language of meaning. One idea rises gently above the rest: ancient reset. Myths were deeply symbolic because ancient people saw themselves reflected in the natural world. They didn't separate humanity from the environment. They believed human history followed the same rhythms as rivers and seasons. And mud, with its soft, shifting nature, captured those rhythms perfectly.